Let's loom knit your sweater. Today is part 2 of 6, the back.
Welcome to GoodKnit Kisses. We're all about helping you stitch your love and love your stitches.
Be sure to get the latest part of our pattern knit along down at the links below. You can also skip to the section you need simply by scrubbing through or mousing through the bottom. You'll see chapter titles to show you different timestamps. This is on every one of our videos. All right, we're on our instructions for the back, and you can see where we have our cast on here. We need 63 stitches to cast on for the extra small, 67 for the medium, and both of those can be done on one flexi loom, either size. Then we have 73 for the large, 79 for extra large, 91 for the 2 or 3XL, and 97 for the 4 or 5XL. So you're going to go ahead and cast those on. So let's look at that now. All right, we have our loom with all of the pegs needed for our size, and it will have one more peg than you actually need. So I've marked with a couple of stitch markers here. I'm going to start at this one and go all the way around. So I'm working with these two pairs together and go all the way in this direction, all the way around, and stop here. It's not necessary to leave these in here at all. In fact, you can take them out when you're done, or if you want to leave this one over here where it is to indicate that's the beginning of your row 1, that would be perfectly fine. So let's look at the yarn for a moment. I recommend taking off the label, the wrapper around it. You're going to pull the yarn from the outside. If you're working with a roving yarn like this one, it's better to pull from the outside than to pull from the inside. If you do a center pull, it can catch on itself because it does have some natural fibers in here, and it can also cause some tension and friction with your sweater. And so I recommend that when you're working with the sweater, you pull from the outside of the ball anyway, because it creates a very even tension flow. Just put it in a bowl or a bag, something to keep it from rolling around and snagging on things. Okay, so we've already covered in our sample video in the swatch. Go back to part 1 if you need help on casting on or doing the ribbing or doing the main stitch. But let's go to our pattern here. So you're going to cast on your number of stitches. I'm going to do 63 for the small, and then you're going to make your 8 rows of ribbing. And then you're going to work the main stitch pattern until you have 19 inches, and it goes all the way up to the top here. That way we are right on par for all sizes. Now this is where you can customize. Let's go back to that sheet I was talking about earlier. So the sweater patterns are designed to fit an average height person, and if you're not average height, this is easy for you to customize. You can lengthen or shorten the sweater, and we kind of talked about that earlier on both the front and the back panel. So this serves for both videos actually, between the ribbing and the armholes. So the ribbing right here is going to remain 2 inches right here, but it's this number that you can change. So always remember, whatever length you determine that you want to make yours, from the bottom of the armpit area down to the bottom of your ribbing, you need to take whatever number that is and minus 2 inches, and then make that middle part, that middle number. Okay, so double check on that, what you want to do, and then when you come over here, write that custom length here. Okay, and then you're going to want to do that on both the front and the back panels. All right, and then let's move on to the next part. All right, so work on that cast on, and then you're going to work on row 1 repeating until you have the 2 inches. And I do want to point out real quick, there is a double asterisk here. So if you're not used to reading patterns, see the double asterisk. That's the beginning of a section that's going to be repeated somewhere later on in the pattern. So just pointing that out. You can see I do have other asterisks here where row 1 says UK, that's a U-wrap knit, and then purl, and you're repeating those two until the last stitch, and then you U-wrap knit. So that's what that means. And as far as the sizes, I think you understand that now. When you see something in parentheses, it's just listing all of the other sizes in order. So you just pick the one that you're going to use. And then you're going to proceed in the texture pattern. This is just like what you've done. I'm just showing you what the actual pattern reads like. So this is the same texture pattern that you did before. row 1, this is setup, knit 1, slip 1 with the yarn in front of the peg, and then repeat that back and forth until the last peg of knit 1, and then on row 2 you purl, and then purl 1 below, knit 1, repeating between those two until the last 2 stitches. Then you have purl 1 below and purl 1. And then the next 2 rows are knitting all of them and repeating them. So you're going to repeat that until your work from the very beginning, including that ribbing, it's going to measure 19 inches or 48 centimeters. And then this right here, this notice says if you're working the custom length of the sweater, use that measurement here. So that's the spot you do it. All right. And so you're just going to continue repeating until we get to shaping the armholes. Do that. Pause your video and I will see you at that point. See you soon. Stop. Okay, so if you have already started knitting and you're trying to determine how long you knit, like how many rows or what the length is, but you're having a hard time measuring, because let's face it, it's hard to measure on a knitting loom because it gets stretched out. This is where your swatch comes back in handy. So I do want to quickly say that if you need to stop, you can stop on a row 2 or a row 4, and I mean after you've completed that row. So you want to be back to the beginning where you normally would start on that peg 1 where we started in the very beginning. So make sure that you have completed a row 2 or completed a row 4. All right, let's look at our measurements so you can determine how to get it accurate. So you're going to need a measuring tape and a calculator for this. And I just take my measuring tape or your hard ruler. Usually a hard ruler is good, but I'm going to use this one in this case. We're going to want to lay our 0 right where our stitch starts. I'm going to go over where this ridge is and this little bump here. I can see it very clearly. This is where this stitch starts, so I'm going to lay it right up next to it, and then I'm going to count, and then I know I have 1, 2, 3 inside here, plus I have this one here, that's 4, and then I have 5 here, and then this one right here is laying in the middle of this stitch. Okay, so I have 5.5 stitches here in my rows, okay, or 5.5 rows. All right, let's jump to our calculator. So we want to determine how many rows to make. Well, it's easier to see how many repeats of the 4 rows we do. So let's go ahead and say the 5.5 rows that we measured times the length that we need to knit. Now you're going to do minus the 2 inches that you had for your ribbing. So we're going to say times 17, and or whatever your custom number is, equals 93.5 rows. All right, so now let's divide it by our row repeat, which is 4. So hit the divide and hit 4. And then I get 23.375. That's really close to 24, making 24 complete repeats of my pattern. Let me show you how to count that on your sample. So here's my sample here, and we have all these really great ridges which mark that special row 2 that we have. So just make sure and count this little bump that's right above where the ribbing is. So that's going to be 1 repeat, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and then 9. There's my last one, and then I had repeated those last 2 rows of knits. So you can see how easy it is to count that. That's going to be much easier when you get all of your knitting on your loom, and I'll show you here in a moment, and that's much better than using a tape measure. This is also handy when you're making your armhole links because you can gauge how many rows you need to make. And you're going to be repeating this, of course, on both panels. All right, let's move on. I want to talk a minute about when you add yarn. So you just add yarn as you go. I recommend doing it on a row 3 or 4 because it's easy just to begin the new strand. If you see, I have these 2 strands here. I've got one of them that I started already weaving in a little bit, but I wanted to keep them long for you. You may notice that it shows a hole on the other side of your work, but if you leave them nice and loose later on, you can pull them in the opposite direction to tighten that up and then use your tapestry needle to weave that in. I recommend not making a knot because this is a wearable, it's a garment, and you don't want to rub against a knot. So if you're used to tying in knots when you change colors, don't do that in this one, and then I'll show you how to weave in these tails later on. Okay, and that'll be more in the finishing video. All right, we're at shaping armholes, and we've worked our custom length, or your 19 inches all the way up. I've actually counted all my ridges. In mine, I needed 24 repeats of the texture pattern, and I ended after a row 4. So I've already got that ready to go. Then let's look at the pattern here. So it says, keeping continuing of pattern. This is how the abbreviations work out. Keeping continuing a pattern, bind off 4 stitches at beginning of next 2 rows, and then this is how many stitches are left after you do that. And then you can see the end of the asterisk section is here. So this is the same on both panels. So we're just going to keep continuing that texture stitch pattern. We're going to bind off at the beginning, finish out that row completely, and then when we start our new row, we're going to bind off 4 more stitches. So let me show you that bind off part right now. All right, so we want to bind off the first 4 stitches, and you can tell that we have, of course, pairs of 2 here, and then we have this one here. So you are going to be back down to having 1 peg with this little pair here. So you're going to bind off this one, these 2, and this one here. Okay, so you'll have 4 empty pegs up to this point. So the way we do that is we're going to knit that first stitch and knit the second stitch, move the second stitch onto the first, and lift up and over to bind off. So that's binding off 1, and then knit the next one, move it up and over, and knit off. That's 2. Move it over, knit the next one, move it over, knit over. That's 3. And then you still need to get rid of this one here, so you'll have an odd number on this little link here. And move that over. All right. Okay, so we bound off these 4 stitches. The first stitch is already completed because we've already worked it once. So if you finished after row 4 like I did, you can start your setup row 1 here, where we're just doing our slip with the yarn in front of the peg, and then work this next stitch. So let me move into position here. So we got that, and knit over, and continue on with our setup row. Or if you had ended after row 2, you would just simply start your knit row on this peg. Okay, so you're going to continue that. You've already got your bound off this direction, and then when you finish this row out completely, go ahead and finish it out that way, and then work in the opposite direction to bind off those stitches and return just as you would. All right, pause your video, and I will see you at this point. See you soon. All right, I'm on the other side, and I do want to show you, if you are working the ones that have those setup rows, you worked all the way to the end, and when you have to start binding off, you've got a couple of these that have that slip with the yarn in front. Go ahead on the second peg in and the 4th peg in, you're just going to knit those over. Okay, you just leave them like this, because that's really what you would be doing when you're knitting one below, or actually purling one below. You have to unknit that stitch and then work them together. So that was just a way to get your stitches all even and set up right. So now we just knit these 2 over, and now we want to bind off. So start by knitting that first stitch, knitting the second stitch, moving up and over, oops, and knitting up and over, moving it. So that's 1, knit the next one, that's 2, moving it over, knit the next one, that's 3. Okay, So we have one more that we need to do. In order to continue in pattern correctly, you can do a purl on this one. Okay, so that keeps it working in pattern because the start of this next row starts the purl one. If you decide to knit that, that's fine. It doesn't make a huge difference. So we've purled that, and then we move it over here, and then knit off, and then move it. Okay. All right, so these two links right here should be completely empty. Now what you can do is just go ahead and take these off. Okay, you can take them off like that, or you can leave them. It doesn't really matter, but this is not necessary to keep them on unless you just like it this big. Okay, but it is nice because you can take them off if you don't need them now. All right, so just continue on in your pattern, and we're going to work the rest of the shaping. So let me get to that. Again, this is the purl one below, and knit one, and continue. So let me grab my pattern. We'll go over the rest of it. So go ahead and count your stitches just to make sure that you have the correct amount. I always recommend going and counting those. All right, so the next part is you're going to continue even in pattern until your armhole measures 8 inches for the smallest, 9 for the medium, 9.5 for the large, 10 for the extra large and the 2XL, which is also 3XL, and then 10.5 for the 4 or 5XL. Okay, and then of course we've got our metrics after that. So you can derive those numbers from using the calculator like you did before and figuring out how many ridges that you need to work. I believe mine was 12 ridges for this, so 12 of those 4-row pattern repeats. So continue in that, pause your video, and we'll meet back up when we shape the shoulders. See you soon. All right, so I have worked my armholes, and I've got all my length that I need for my size and you for yours. And now let's go on to shape shoulders. So let's pull the pattern out, and it says keeping continuing of pattern, bind off, and it has a number of stitches beginning of next 2 rows. Then your number of stitches beginning at the following 2 rows. Leave the remaining stitches on a holder. Okay, so or on a stitch holder. So we're going to continue the pattern just as we've been, but you're going to bind off the first 7 stitches for extra small and small, 8 for the medium, 9 for the large, 10 for the extra large, 13 for the 2 or 3XL, and 15 for the larger size, the 4 or 5XL. Now that's going to be at the beginning of the next 2 rows. That's just what you did before. You just only had 4 stitches. So it's going to go in that many stitches on each side. And then after you do that, then you're going to do it one more time. So you're going to be going just 4 more rows, and then we're completing this panel. So the different row, after you do the first 7 or 8 or 9 or 10 or 13 or 15, after you do those two rows, then you have a different number. So it only changes really on these two. It's on the extra large and the 2 or 3XL. So you're doing 7, 8, 9, 11, 14, or 15, and then you're going to leave the remaining stitches on the stitch holder, and you're going to be using that provisional bind off. Okay, so I'll show you what that looks like when we're done. So you already know how to bind them off, so go ahead and do those 4 rows, and meet me at the end on that last stitch, and I'll show you how to take these off the stitch holder. See you soon. You know what? I have completely forgotten to give you a clue on something. I have failed to tell you, if you are binding off and your number is not lining up correctly, your patterning will shift and move over. So because everyone has a different bind off number this time, you may or may not start a row 2 the same way that you did before. You may have to start with 2 knits and then do your slip with the yarn in front. What you can do is study your knitting, just flip it over and look and find the row that has one of these here. So we have this right here. Actually, let's go over here. It's going to be better at the front of the line. Okay, so we know that this row is going to have this purl 2 below, so that lines up with this peg, and this peg needs to have the slip with the yarn in front, and it doesn't. So I need to undo these and come back and go ahead and just knit these first 2 stitches and then work these. Now I could just unknit these stitches and knit these, but I'm just going to undo the whole row and come back. It's just an easier fix, and that way my tension will remain even. So that's my little tip to you. Make sure when you do your bind off, start on the right patterning, and remember when you finish on the end of this one, you can knit over those first stitches that you're going to have to be binding off in the return row, because you don't need to have them waiting with this extra strand in front. Okay, go ahead and do those 4 rows, and I'll meet you at the end and show you how to take your stuff off the loom with the provisional bind off. See you soon. All right, so I have bound off my stitches over the last 4 rows, and you should have this sort of jagged line here. It kind of goes up a little bit, so it is supposed to look like that, and I will show you how we use that later on. This is going to be one shoulder, and then the other side is the other shoulder, and it gets sewn in specifically, and we'll work on that in another part of the video. You can see I opened up my loom already, and I had actually taken off the extra links as I went, and it was easier for me to see how many stitches I did. So once I completed the amount of stitches I was supposed to bind off, I just disconnected those and reconnected it again, and then I knew that I was getting down to where I need to be. So go ahead and double check that you have the correct number of remaining stitches for your size, and then you're going to do a provisional bind off. I'm just going to open this back up again and make sure that I have a nice long strand. You can use a stitch marker, but I'm just going to use a contrasting yarn that's nice and smooth, and it's long enough to go through them. And then go ahead and cut off your yarn. You can leave a 6 to 9 inch tail, something you can weave in later, or you can measure out about 3 times the length of one of these shoulders here and then cut it, because if you're not using this yarn, which can break for seaming, if you're not using this particular roving, you can use a different one and use this for your seaming later on, and you'll see that in another part of the video. But for now, I'm just gonna cut this off and start working on my provisional bind off. So just go to the end, leave that tail there, and just how we did before on our swatch, just pull it on through, which you already know how to do this, but I just wanted to show you visually. So you're going to be taking all of these stitches off, and then take the panel off and use your loom again for the next panel. Okay, so all the same stitches, so you would end up connecting these 2 again. So I'll pull this off and show you what it looks like. Here is our final back panel, and you can see the held stitches here are for the back of the collar, and then we have our left and right shoulders over here that we'll stitch in later, and then here is your tail for where we finished off. So now I'm so proud of you. I just wanted to say that for starting your sweater, and stay tuned for our next video where we work on the front panel, and this part we will have some shaping for our neck.
Thanks for joining us today, where we help you stitch your love and love your stitches. See you again soon.